I am Harriet Spinell, and the person who helped on the program today, Joe Garcia, is off in Washington, D.C., giving a paper presentation at a conference, so he was unable to be here, but we did this together. I want to welcome our two guests. We have a very full program today. What I'm going to let each of the guests will speak, hopefully with no more than 20 minutes, and less if they can do it in less even, but I think that's going to be pushing him. Then you will be allowed to ask questions, and then hopefully we'll have a couple minutes at the end that they can make a comment if there's something that got missed. Our one speaker, Professor Byers, has to leave by 1:30 to catch a ferry, and Rear Admiral Garret is able to stay a little bit longer than that if there are more questions. So, today we're going to talk about the opening of the Arctic waters, the political, economical, and environmental and social consequences. And I think we're very lucky to have these two very talented people who have some pretty good knowledge about the situation. First, Professor Michael Byers. He's a professor and Canadian Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law at the University of British Columbia. And prior to that, he was at Duke University and other places. His work focus is on the Arctic, the use of military force, and Canadian-United States relations. And as been mentioned, he has books. His most recent book on international law and the Arctic, he was awarded a $50,000 Donner Prize for the best book on the public policy in Canada. Then is Rear Admiral Jeffrey Garrett, U.S. Coast Guard retired. He's a graduate of the Coast Guard Academy and the Naval Postgraduate School, spent much of his active duty career in the Coast Guard involved in polar operations and icebreaking. His service includes command of the polar icebreakers, Polar Sea and Healy, and numerous deployments to various ports of the Arctic and Antarctica. And since retiring, he has continued participating in a number of Arctic studies with the National Academy of Science committees, his ice piloting, whatever that is, and consulting projects concerning polar issues. So I'm first going to call on Rear Admiral Garrett, and then when he has had his time speaking, it will be Professor Michael Byers.
Well, thank you, Harriet. It's indeed a pleasure to be here to speak to the Bellingham City Club in the great city of Bellingham. When I'm invited to speak about the Arctic or polar affairs in general, I can't turn it down. It's just a real passion, and I spent most of my 35-year Coast Guard career in polar operations on icebreakers or in some kind of programmatic management of that. So I've been fortunate to be able to continue some of that work since I retired as well. So I'm happy to be able to speak to you here today. The only problem is trying to talk about only 20 minutes about the Arctic is a challenge. I'm probably going to fail at, but I'm going to go pretty quickly through the slides. And I do have some visuals here. I apologize for the format. For some reason, the projector has distorted these from side to side, but hopefully you'll get an idea of what they're trying to indicate. I'm calling my remarks the Arctic back on the map, and the reason for that is if you look back over the 20th century, there's not been a lot of talked about in the Arctic. Here and there, perhaps, if you grew up as I did with this kind of mental image of the world, the classic Mercator projection, you'll see that it distorts the polar regions in a very bizarre way. It makes Greenland look bigger than Africa, for example. And in fact, this chart only goes to about 80 degrees north and 80 degrees south, so it doesn't even really show all of the polar regions and certainly not the heart of the Arctic as well. So it's kind of symptomatic. The Arctic has been off the map, literally not in the collective consciousness very much over the last century or so, certainly since the end of the age of heroic exploration. But the Arctic is really a pretty much enclosed ocean basin. How do you define it? Well, you can define it by the Arctic Circle, which is a pretty standard way of doing it, but that leaves out the Bering Sea and the Aleutians and some other areas that are certainly Arctic or subarctic in nature. You can define it as the 10 degrees Celsius isotherm, or perhaps as the tree line, and I don't know if you can see those. The light green line is the tree line. What's interesting about the last two definitions is with climate change happening, they may actually be shrinking the Arctic. as the tree line moves north and the temperatures increase somewhat. But there's 5 nations with Arctic real estate, if you will. Russia, Canada, U.S., Denmark, by virtue of its foreign affairs supervision of Greenland, and Norway. Kind of a anecdotal perspective on what's happening in the Arctic. In 1845, Sir John Franklin led a couple of ships, the Erebus and the Terror, up to find the Northwest Passage. And it was an expedition that was doomed to failure, unfortunately, and coming as it did on the heels of the Little Ice Age, the ice was terrible. It didn't melt in the summer. This very melodramatic Victorian rendition of HMS Erebus gives some sense of what they were fighting, but the expedition ended up perishing, and not until many rescue and expeditions later did they find out what exactly had happened to the Franklin expedition. But if you spool forward 111 years, in 1957, 3 small U.S. Coast Guard cutters, the Storis, Bramble, and Spar, made a west to east transit to the Northwest Passage. And again, they encountered a few open water areas like in Bellot Strait, but it was a 64-day ordeal, even with ships with steel hulls and ice strengthening, diesel electric power plants, and all that sort of thing. They battled ice the whole way, and it was quite certainly not the tragic end that the Franklin expedition had, but a real struggle. And then, a few years after that, in 2011, I was fortunate enough to be the ice pilot on a large motor yacht, a 117-foot vessel, and there was no ice. We spent the month of September going from the eastern part in Lancaster Sound all the way around to Nome, and we saw no ice, no sea ice whatsoever. A few chips of glacier ice that had calved off some glaciers up in Lancaster Island, but open water the whole way. So clearly, this is very anecdotal, but clearly it shows that the Arctic has changed a lot. And of course, you've all read about the shrinkage of the Arctic ice pack. This is a somewhat dated slide, but it shows how from 1982 to 2007 in September, which is the annual least extent of the ice pack, how it shrunk. And then at the bottom is a kind of a compilation from 5 different models projecting the size of the minimum ice pack. And there's indication since this was put together that this may be too conservative, that the ice may be going away even faster, and we may, in not too many years, see an ice-free Arctic Ocean during the summer months. But it's not just the extent of the ice pack that's shrinking. That is the the horizontal distribution of it, but it's also the volume. It's also thinning out. The little cube on the left side there shows that from 1979, when we first started getting continuous satellite imagery of the Arctic and the ice pack, to 2009, 3 decades, the volume of the ice, its extent and its thickness had shrunk to only 38% of what it had been 30 years before. So clearly a lot less ice in the Arctic. Well, what does that mean? I think in the Pacific Northwest, nobody would be surprised to hear that the U.S. is one of the Arctic nations. Maybe in Florida, not so much, but certainly the reason for that is Alaska. And in 1867, the Secretary of State, Secretary Seward, took up the Tsar Alexander's offer to buy Alaska for $7.2 million, I think. And of course, he was widely mocked for that. This was Seward's folly or Seward's icebox. Why would we want this worthless real estate when we're still trying to recover from the ravages of the Civil War? But he was a very far-seeing man and certainly saw the potential. But what the country did was it turned to a very small government agency, the Revenue Cutter Service, the predecessor of the Coast Guard, and they started sending every season ships up to the Arctic Ocean and up to the Arctic shoreline, Bering Sea shoreline, Aleutians of Alaska. And they were first interested in just exploring what it was we bought, because nobody really knew, other than Sitka and a few other fur trading outposts, nobody really knew what Alaska consisted of. But exploration, science, the naturalist John Muir made a cruise in the cutter Corwin, wrote a book about it that's pretty interesting, so doing science in those early years as well. Enforcing some of the earliest environmental laws. When the Alaska fur seal faced extinction due to overhunting, there were laws in the past, and the revenue cutters became the enforcement agency, as well as laws protecting some of the native communities from alcohol and other ill effects from whaling ships going up there. And the ships were really the only civil government in Alaska for over 50 years and providing assistance to native communities in times of hardship and famine. And then if you fast forward quickly, a lot of interesting history in those years we don't have time to talk about, but after the turn of the millennium, certainly a lot of stuff started happening in the Arctic, and you're seeing it. You pick up newspapers, magazines, TV shows these days have lots of Arctic material in it. I'm going to try to give a very brief overview of 7 categories of issues in the Arctic, and this is going to be really fast, so I'll ask you to bear with me, but I'll be glad to certainly talk about any of them and answer more questions later. We'll talk about transportation, oil and gas, resource exploitation, tourism, the native people, science, environmental concerns, and the geopolitics of the region. So transportation, you've probably seen this kind of pictorial before. The Northern Sea Route across the top of Russia shaves something like 4,000 nautical miles, 22 days perhaps from northern European ports to the Far East, to Japan, Korea, China. Certainly it's seasonal. After years of ambivalence, the Russians have decided to really try to commercialize and promote it. For many years there was very much of a closed area that they wanted no foreigners in. U.S. icebreakers had been turned away in the past, seeking to explore the edges of the Northern Sea Route. But now they put out regulations, they've got icebreaker services available that are improving the aids of navigation and even building some search and rescue facilities up there to try to commercialize. And we've gone from two commercial ships made the entire voyage in 2009, some 71 did last year. So it's increasing. The alternative, of course, is to go through the Med, Suez Canal, Indian Ocean, Straits of Malacca, and all the way around. Much longer, more reliable in the sense that you don't encounter any ice or that sort of thing. But it goes through several areas of political instability, piracy in the Indian Ocean and in Southeast Asia in some parts, and lots of, if you follow the news, you know what's happening in Egypt, which controls the Suez Canal, what's happening in the South China Sea with various countries in conflict with China over ownership of some of the island chains there. You know, certainly an unstable route. So it's very intriguing to talk about how developed this waterway could become. On the other side, the Northwest Passage through the Canadian archipelago, I don't think we're seeing quite, I'm sure Professor Byers will talk about it, but not as much through traffic of a commercial nature, but more ships are going through. In 2009, the Arctic Council did a pretty comprehensive assessment of marine shipping, maritime shipping, and I guess the takeaway for me is that whether you go through the Northern Sea Route, or whether you go through the Northwest Passage, or whether you go up just to do some destinational work up in the Arctic, on the Pacific side, you've got to go through the Bering Strait, and that puts it very close to U.S. waters and U.S. territories. And this is something that the Coast Guard has started to try to grapple with in terms of how do we ensure safety, how do we ensure security, how do we respond to accidents and potential oil spills and things like that. Oil and gas development, again, this has been in the news. The U.S. Geological Survey has indicated big numbers, maybe 13% of the world's undiscovered oil, 30% of the world's undiscovered gas. The numbers don't matter so much as that it's big, and the estimates are there are lots of oil and gas resources in the Arctic. The Russians have been very aggressive in exploiting theirs to offset declining production from some of their shoreside places. But we're also seeing, and the Norwegians are moving further north toward Arctic areas in some of their offshore development. Canada, seeing a lot of activity in the Beaufort Sea in the 70s and 80s, and maybe some interest picking up now again. And even in Greenland, there's been some mixed results, but they're also looking at offshore oil and gas. In Alaska, of course, the big headliner is Shell, which bought $2.1 billion worth of offshore leases in the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas a few years ago. In 2012, during the summer season, they went up to drill exploratory wells in the Chukchi and the Beaufort, one in each. Did not complete those exploratory wells and had a number of mishaps that were widely publicized. And of course, there's been quite a bit of controversy about Shell's oil development up there. And they are currently kind of on hold. There's they were going to go this coming summer, but an injunction has been placed on the government's environmental impact statement. So until that's resolved, 2015 would probably be the earliest that they could go again and try to complete those exploratory wells. Tourism, this is a really interesting one. I read somewhere that more than 1 million people every year visit some part of the Arctic. It's really big in Svalbard and in Greenland. A lot of cruise ships going up there, but even on the Alaska side, I think a couple years ago it was 7 ships and some 3,000 passengers that were up in the Alaskan Arctic sightseeing. Unfortunately, the Alaska Arctic coastline is not very scenic. It's just a low sandy beach that with shallow water extending pretty far offshore, so it doesn't have the scenic icebergs and things like that and mountains that you can see in Greenland, but still it's picking up. The Russians for years have been taking people to the North Pole in their biggest nuclear icebreakers. I think that's about $25,000 a shot if you want to take that kind of a cruise. And I guess one of the most surprising things to me, going back when I first went up back in the 70s, is you see sailboats. The adventure traveler. This particular picture in the lower left I took in Cambridge Bay was a young Australian couple that were sailing this 28-foot boat through the Northwest Passage, and they were debating when we had a beer with them. They were debating whether they were going to have to go back to Australia to earn some more money and leave their boat here and come back the next year. But I don't know if they made it or not. But still, it's pretty amazing that people in small craft like this are able to go through the Northwest Passage. Certainly would have shocked Sir John Franklin, I think. But with all increasing tourism, there's not much of a safety net. And I'll say up front, this is not in the Arctic. This was the motor vessel Explorer, formerly the Lindblad Explorer, sank in 2010, I think, 2009, off the Antarctic Peninsula. It hit a piece of ice, flooded and sank. All the passengers were picked up by another ship, so there were no casualties. But it just shows the kind of thing that can happen, and it's a very lucky circumstance that there were other ships nearby and that there wasn't loss of life from the passengers, many of whom were elderly. And I'm told that for a lot of them it was the adventure of their lifetime, to be able to have your ship sink, climb into a lifeboat, and then get picked up by another cruise ship a little bit later. But this is the kind of stuff that, like the Commandant of the Coast Guard says, this is the kind of thing that makes him lose sleep at night. Northwest Passage had a number of groundings. I think a couple of years ago, the Clipper Adventurer was a small cruise ship, ran aground, hit an uncharted rock. Fortunately, a Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker was nearby, was able to evacuate everybody safely. Again, another close call. Native peoples, certainly rising consciousness here. Back in the late 70s, the Inuit Circumpolar Conference was formed up to give all of the native peoples in the US, Canada, Greenland, Russia, and even Scandinavia kind of a forum for talking about their rights and interests with all the other things happening in the Arctic. And Canada created a new section of the old Northwest Territories named Nunavut. I love their license plates. But certainly, and even in Alaska, with the Alaska Pipeline came the creation of native corporations, which gave the native peoples there a legal and economic basis for having more control over their future and the resources and some of the political decisions that are being made. But the native peoples certainly have indicated that they are now going to be players in the process, not just an afterthought. And then science. I spent much of my icebreaker operations taking science parties up to the Arctic and gathering data, but it's still one of the least investigated major oceans in the world. There's relatively little data. Of course, climate change is a huge driver of scientific inquiry because we're kind of seeing a lot of those changes in the Arctic earlier and in greater magnitude than in other places of the Earth. And one of the things that seems very reasonable to me is, if you are going to have development in the Arctic, whether it be transportation or oil and gas exploration, that sort of thing, having better data will allow you to make better decisions and better regulation and more favorable outcomes for all those human activities. And then, of course, environmental concerns. All of the major environmental organizations, I couldn't resist the picture. all of the major environmental organizations have pretty strong Arctic platforms in terms of protecting the wildlife, preventing, rampant exploitation and that sort of thing. The idea of having the Arctic set aside as a preserve, much like the Antarctic Treaty has done for Antarctica, where you have no military activities, no onshore resource development, has been proposed. I don't think that's going to work for a number of different reasons. But anyway, the environmental concerns about human activity in the Arctic are certainly very, very big issues. And then finally, geopolitics. The Arctic Council, back in 1996, formed as a forum for the 8 Arctic nations to talk about Arctic issues. Actually, 2007 is kind of the date that stands out in my mind as when, modern interest in the Arctic really got going. And this was caused by the Russians in their inimitable fashion, went up to, with a mini sub and planted a titanium flag on the seabed at the North Pole. And of course, this has all kinds of symbolic overtones, and of course that got people really talking about, well, who owns the Arctic and how are these issues going to be resolved? So there are some minor sovereignty issues still at play in the Arctic. The Norwegians and Russians resolved a little boundary dispute in offshore waters that they had a few years ago, but there are several others still, but nothing really major, certainly nothing that people I think are prepared to fight about. But it's also interesting that non-Arctic players are interested in the Arctic. The Chinese have had their research vessel in the Arctic Ocean off Alaska for a number of years. Many nations, India, China, Japan, South Korea, as well as several European nations have asked to be observers in the Arctic Council. They can't be members, but they can have observer status. So there is a lot of international issues or interest there. And then probably one of the biggest sovereignty issues that I can think of is claims of the extended continental shelf. Now this stems from a provision in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea that says that countries may claim certain rights to the continental shelf that extends beyond the 200-mile exclusive economic zone that all nations have under international law. But to have a valid claim to that extended continental shelf area, you have to present hydrographic and geologic data that meet certain criteria. So it gets pretty technical pretty fast. But for the past 7 summers, the Healy, the icebreaker on the right in the picture here, is the newest U.S. icebreaker, has a bottom mapping sonar and has done extensive survey work up off the coast of Alaska to look at these outer continental shelf areas and to build the basis in terms of data for a possible U.S. claim to those extended continental shelf areas. And to give just some idea, the U.S. has potentially 6 extended continental shelf areas, one of which is in the Arctic, but the total of them is more than 1 million square kilometers, which is about twice the size of California. So it's not insignificant. But even to build the case for the extended continental shelf, there's been a lot of great scientific data that's been collected. The topographic figure, 3D figure there in the lower right, was an underwater ridge about 40 kilometers by 13 kilometers wide, rising about 2,000 meters off the seafloor, that was discovered during one of the Healy's cruises that they never knew about. So a huge underwater feature that was not on any charts. And if I was in the Navy as a submariner, I would really want to know about that kind of stuff, since subs do go up there sometimes. So what's the rest of the world thinking about all this? Well, Russia, as I mentioned a couple of times, is probably the most aggressive Arctic nation. They've declared the Arctic as intrinsic to the Russian national pride and so forth. So oil and gas, tourism, a lot of those things. They are building several classes of new icebreakers. But even the European Union had plans to build the world's largest icebreaking vessel. They kind of shelved that a couple of years ago due to financial constraints, but it'll be interesting to see if they drag that back out in better times. But Canada, I won't dwell on that since my colleague will be talking about it, I'm sure, has some plans to design and build a new heavy icebreaker, ice strength and patrol craft, and some logistics facilities. China's building a second icebreaking research vessel. The Koreans built one a couple of years ago. Japan has built a new one. And then South Africa, Chile, and Australia, they're focused more to the Antarctic, but they're also building ice-breaking assets to become better, more proactive in the other polar waters. So what are the polar issues for the U.S.? And again, this is a real fast summary, but I think transportation safety and security is a big one. How are we going to provide the kind of resources? The Arctic Council a couple of years ago laid out a search and rescue responsibilities for the Arctic, which is a great first start, but it didn't build any new resources. It didn't put any bases or helicopters or ships or anything up there. So how do you provide safety and security of the area? Environmental protection versus oil development. What's the balance there? Are we going to let Shell drill and produce oil, or is that going to be shut down? I don't know. Northern Alaska communities are affected by all development and even by the climate change. This pictures of Kivalina, a town of about 400 on the northwest Alaska coast. It has lost half of its land area since the 50s due to coastal erosion. And that erosion is accelerating because with less ice cover, there's more wave action against the community. The community knows it needs to move, but they can't agree on where to go. So despite heroic effort to build seawalls and things like that, it's quickly going away. And then the next one is probably the biggest one from my perspective, and that's turning policy into capability. The U.S. has issued Arctic strategies, implementation plans, all kinds of stuff, but we haven't invested in the resources. We've still got aging icebreakers and a limited infrastructure on the North Coast. We really don't have a lot of presence in the area. And then finally, the international leadership, and the law of the sea. The law of the sea is a treaty the U.S. has signed but not ratified. It's been held up in the Senate for a couple of decades now. Every Secretary of State, Chief of Naval Operations, Commandant of the Coast Guard, and many other senior officials have gone before the Senate and testified that we need to pass that treaty so that the U.S. is a full player at the table, but that hasn't happened yet. So I'm getting the hook, but I hopefully had to put my Arctic Explorer picture up there. But I'll be happy to talk more later. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a great overview, and I think everybody sees there's a lot to listen to. So next we'll have Professor Byers.
It's wonderful to be here and to follow such a distinguished speaker as Admiral Garrett, who actually did most of my work for me with that tour de force of the Arctic. It's also really good to be here because I actually live just 25 miles directly west of here on Salt Spring Island, British Columbia, south of the 49th parallel. And therefore reminded daily by the presence of our benevolent neighbor, the United States. I also have two children who were born in the United States, in Durham, North Carolina, when I was a professor at Duke University. And the eldest, who is 13, wants to join the U.S. Coast Guard. And I fully support his plans because it's a remarkable service and it does your country proud, just as the Canadian Coast Guard does my country proud. The Arctic is a dangerous place. Climate change is happening. In fact, it's happening with blinding speed. I have seen entire glaciers disappear in just 5 years on Baffin Island in northeastern Canada. And I have seen, as Admiral Garrett has seen, an ice-free Northwest Passage in the late summer, where historically 30 feet or more of thick, hard, multi-year ice would block the way. It's a remarkable transformation. Anyone here who has any question about the reality of climate change, just go north. And remember that this is happening at blinding speed within human lifetimes rather than at geological speed. This is radically different from anything that planet Earth has seen before. That's one message. The Arctic is, as Senator John McCain has said, our canary in the coal mine when it comes to climate change. Speaking of the dangers, and I want to underline this, because the dangers of the Arctic, the inhospitality of the island, of the Arctic, the remoteness impacts upon everything that we as countries do there. In the last 4 years, I have lost 4 friends in aviation accidents in the Arctic, including the 3 men on the Coast Guard icebreaker last September. And despite, or perhaps because of climate change, there are persistent and new challenges in the Arctic. So for instance, between Baffin Island in Canada's northeast and Greenland, we actually see more icebergs than we used to. Because climate change is melting the surface of the Greenland ice cap, which means that more water is finding its way down to the base of the ice cap and lubricating the movement of the glaciers into the sea. And the glaciers are therefore calving more quickly into icebergs, and we see an increase in icebergs. So although the sea ice, which forms on the ocean, is disappearing, there is more glacial ice in the water, and that glacial ice is very hard. It's thousands of years old. And that's the kind of ice that poses a very serious danger to ships because it floats low in the water and has a consistency similar to concrete. And so the Admiral, I think, will agree with me in saying that operating north of Alaska is fundamentally different from operating in Baffin Bay because of the different kinds of ice that exist. All kinds of dangers. To give you another example, I was speaking to a conference of shipping executives from Asian countries a few years ago who were gleefully anticipating the commercial opportunities of a seasonally ice-free Arctic, planning to send thousands of container ships along the north coast of Russia and indeed of Alaska and Canada. And I looked at them and I said, well, have you heard of icing? And and these were men who made millions of dollars each year, being executives of major corporations, and they looked at me and said, icing? What's that? And I explained that icing is what happens if you have open water, but the air temperature is below freezing, and there are gale force winds and waves and spray. And so the water sprays up on the superstructure of the ship and freezes and builds up, and if not dealt with, can cause the vessel to overturn and sink. New dangers, new challenges. Another example that comes with climate change and the improved accessibility is the challenge of non-state security threats. I remember how in 2005, the then U.S. Ambassador to Canada, Paul Cellucci, publicly stated that he had asked the State Department to re-examine the United States legal position concerning the Northwest Passage. Now, just so you know, the U.S. position is that the Northwest Passage is an international strait that is open to foreign shipping pretty much without restraint. Canada's position is that it constitutes Canadian internal waters subject to the full force of Canadian law. And Ambassador Cellucci in 2005 said, well, in a post-9/11 world, maybe the Canadian position makes more sense for the United States because of the possibility of terrorists using the Northwest Passage to access North America. And wouldn't it be better to have the full force of Canadian law applying, given that Canada and the United States are partners in the defense of North America? So climate change, disappearing ice, new kinds of security threats, creating new potential risks. And I could go on, and Admiral Garrett has already mentioned this, and talk about the environmental risks of shipping oil, of drilling for oil in the Arctic. And let me just mention in that context that we need to be very careful when we drill for oil or ship oil, or indeed run cargo ships through that are carrying large amounts of bunker oil, because of the extreme fragility of the Arctic marine environment, the remoteness of the region, and the fact that oil does not degrade and dissipate in the same way in frigid Arctic water as it would, for instance, in the Gulf of Mexico, where fortunately there was a lot of bacterial activity that could help to degrade the oil after that terrible blowout a few years ago. New risks, new challenges. Now, the good news is that Arctic nations are cooperating. To give you one example, Admiral Garrett showed you a slide where he pointed at the US icebreaker Healy doing bathymetry with a multi-beam sonar. He should have also pointed out that there was a second red and white ship in the picture. He was pressed for time. Which was the Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker, the Louis S. Saint Laurent. Because the US Coast Guard and the Canadian Coast Guard are very, they're pretty strong friends. And they realized that conducting this kind of research with just one icebreaker is hardly optimal, because if you're breaking ice, you're creating noise and vibrations that distort the scientific data that's being collected by your instruments. The best way to do it is to have two icebreakers working in tandem. Icebreaker in front, breaking the ice, the other one tucked in behind, collecting the bathymetry, or if it's the US icebreaker in front and the Canadian icebreaker behind, doing the seismic work, measuring the geology of the seabed. And that's what Canada and the United States did in the Beaufort Sea and further northward in the Canadian-Canada basin for, I think, 4 summers in a row. And so I can say to you that much of that expanse of seabed over which you and your children and grandchildren will hold title in the future comes to you courtesy of a Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker, because you could not have done it without us, just as on the Canadian side, we owe the US Coast Guard our gratitude, because we have all kinds of data that we could not have collected on our own. And the same kind of cooperation will eventually occur with regards to the Northwest Passage, despite our different legal positions. I'm hopeful that we can come to a legal resolution of some kind. I would just mention here that we actually share control over a very important waterway that passes through and is sovereign, either in some stretches sovereign Canadian water, or in other stretches sovereign American water, and that is the St. Lawrence Seaway, which we built together as two nations. Or to give you another example, the Strait of Juan de Fuca and Harrow Strait and Boundary Pass, just off of Bellingham here, is an international strait. Like the US position on the Northwest Passage, but with intense cooperation from the two coastal states, the US on one side and Canada on the other. And as the Admiral pointed out, the US is coming to the realization that it is in fact what is called, this is a legal term, a straight state. Because of Bering Strait, because of the Strait of Juan de Fuca, and also, I should mention, because of Unimac Pass, which is a narrow channel through the Aleutian Islands, which accommodates already roughly 5,000 large cargo ships each year. And that is an international strait too, and the United States has to figure out with Canada and other countries how we cooperate to tighten regulations, improve standards in these waterways, some of which pass through exceedingly fragile areas and are subject to, or will be subject to, much more traffic. So just to give you one final example, just offshore, I don't know how many of you know about Kinder Morgan Pipeline's plans for Juan-de-Fuca Strait, which involve more than one large tanker a day full of bitumen from northern Alberta, shipped to Burnaby in Vancouver, and then out from there through the waters off the coastline of this beautiful state. So we need to figure out, our two governments, how to make sure that that only happens if it can be truly safe. One last thing to mention, and then I do want to turn to questions. And that concerns, in respect of cooperation, concerns Russia. You'll see from this map that I think is on most tables that Russia has very significant Arctic interests, in large part because Russia, in terms of its land territory, extends around roughly half of the Arctic Ocean. Russia is still, after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, still by far the largest nation on Earth. And a very large portion of Russia is in the Arctic, and Russia already obtains roughly 20% of its gross domestic product from its Arctic regions. Russia is a serious Arctic country. It has, for instance, 16 deep water ports along its northern coastline. The United States has none. Canada's most northern port is actually in the province of Manitoba, at the very south end of Hudson Bay, roughly 1,000 miles from the Northwest Passage, so we essentially have none as well. Russia is way ahead of us in terms of developing its own Arctic. Russia is also a party to the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and it's no surprise why they chose to be a member, because with that enormous coastline come extensive rights, which are recognized in the convention. And just in case anyone is wondering, the United States has not ratified the convention, but successive administrations, starting with the Reagan administration, have recognized the key provisions as binding customary international law, and it's on that basis that the Coast Guard and the Navy operate. So Russia has an interest in having a recognized exclusive economic zone of 200 nautical miles off of its shoreline, which includes off of its islands, which give it vast, vast EEZs. It has an interest in the possibility of asserting rights over extended continental shelves, and has been collecting an awful lot of scientific data to that end, and indeed cooperating with other countries. There was a promising moment a few years ago when Canada and Denmark pooled their financial resources to charter a Russian icebreaker to map the seabed near the North Pole. To give you a sense as to how far this cooperation extends, I have actually traveled through the Northwest Passage, through what Canada regards as internal waters, on a ship owned by the Russian Academy of Science, with the full permission of the Canadian government, I should say. So when you see what's happening in Ukraine, be very concerned about the relationship between NATO and Russia in Ukraine and around Ukraine. But don't necessarily assume that those tensions will extend to the Arctic. Russia has been cooperating very well in the Arctic. Just a few years ago, it, together with the United States, led the negotiation of an Arctic-wide search and rescue treaty. More recently, it partnered in the negotiation of a treaty on oil spill preparedness and response. And as I've said, Russia is cooperating in terms of sharing data with respect to extended continental shelves, and has every interest in following the rules in the Convention on the Law of the Sea. Russia is very keen to develop international shipping through its northern waters and charges tolls, sorry, they're not tolls, they're fees for ice-breaking escorts. I sometimes think that Canada and the United States might do the same thing on a cost recovery basis. And Russia is concerned about non-state threats along its northern coastline. There are smugglers in Russia, just like there are smugglers in the San Juan Islands and southern Gulf Islands. Russia has concerns about terrorism, and Russia is concerned about the safety challenges raised by having 70 or more large cargo ships transiting the entire northern sea route each summer. I see no evidence that Russia is preparing for state-to-state conflict in the Arctic. Now, I have met Vladimir Putin, and I dislike Vladimir Putin. But I can see a rational actor when I look at Vladimir Putin, operating within his own framework, getting away with what he can. And there are two things that Vladimir Putin knows about the Arctic. One thing he knows is that militarizing the Arctic would be extraordinarily expensive, would be measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. The Soviet Union militarized the Arctic, and look where that took it. Again, incredible remoteness, punishing temperatures, challenges like sea ice and glacial ice, and don't forget the several months of total darkness and winter. Not a place where you invest in a military that you don't think you'll need in that region. And then there's another consideration. Russia is desperate to develop its Arctic offshore oil and gas. Again, already 20% of its GDP comes from its Arctic region. Much of that comes from oil and gas onshore. Those reserves are being exhausted. It needs to move offshore, and guess what? It doesn't have the capital or the technology to do that. And so Russia has been courting Western companies like Statoil, the Norwegian state-owned oil company that is the leader in Arctic offshore oil and gas, and BP, and Exxon, and Shell, and other major Western players, because they need that technology, they need that capital. And yes, they're trying to get technology and capital from China and elsewhere also, but this is the future economy and therefore the political future of their president, Vladimir Putin, and he is not a stupid man. So just last week, for instance, in a speech, he directed comments at Canada and said, stay away from Ukraine. Canada's a long way away from Ukraine, but guess what? Russia recognizes that we have similar Arctic interests. That's a message that the Canadian Prime Minister is digesting. It's one that the Obama administration already understands. There are enough problems in the world, there are enough challenges in the NATO-Russian relationship that to extend those problems into the Arctic would be to the benefit of no one. We live in dangerous and uncertain times, but the good news is that a quarter century after the end of the Cold War, the potential for war in the Arctic is not one of our, or should not be one of our major concerns. Non-state actors, yes. Climate change, absolutely. Search and rescue, the other challenges that arise from an increasingly busy Arctic. These are all important. We need to step up. Canada, the United States, other countries. But if anyone tells you that we're going to see another ice station zebra, you can tell them that they should listen to Admiral Garret and the other wise people who work or until recently worked for the U.S. government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think, once again, a lot of information. And thank you for covering the Russian end. I think that's, a lot of us have questions there. Now it's the time for questions, and I have two people who are going to carry mics. Okay. Okay, over here in this corner and here. Chuck and Jane. Oh, I thought that was yours. And as usual, members with badges have first choice on questions. So just let one of the spotters raise your hand. There have to be questions. Okay, one back here.
What is the possibility? I don't understand much about the oil thing. But let's say that there was a lot of oil that was in fact harvested out of the Arctic region. What is its importance on being able to take that oil and bring it to Washington State and dock it at the coal terminal so that we could unload to oil refineries here to process it? Is that a concern?
Michael?
It should be. And despite the excitement about Arctic oil and gas, if one actually goes back and looks at the U.S. Geological Survey report that caused all the excitement some 5 or 6 years ago, the U.S. GS is careful to point out that their total estimates for undiscovered reserves in the entire Arctic amount to roughly 3 years of global supply. Arctic oil and gas is not going to get us past peak oil. If anything, it's only going to buy us a couple of years. And look, my own view is that we should get on with the transition to alternative sources of energy. And not risk this beautiful coastline to eke out a couple of extra years of oil.
I say one question, two questions on the same.
Does the technology exist to clean up an oil spill if one should occur in the Arctic?
No. Is this on? Yeah. No, it's not. And certainly, you know, as Dr. Byers mentioned,
Repeat the question.
does the technology exist to clean up an oil spill in the Arctic? As Dr. Byers pointed out, you know, the Macondo Deepwater Horizon spill in the Gulf of Mexico was actually a great place for it to happen if it was going to happen, because you had the warm weather, reasonable sea conditions, lots of infrastructure along the coast, lots of you know, pre-staged cleanup materials, the ability to deploy all kinds of response forces, and the bacterial action that actually degraded a lot of the oil naturally. All of those things don't exist in the Arctic. So you've got seasonal ice cover, you've got all, which nobody knows how to clean it up once it gets under the ice. You've got cold water, cold air temperatures. You don't have any infrastructure up there to speak of, although there is some in Prudhoe Bay, but not very much. So no, it would be very. There was a big National Academy study recently released on that, and it's full of questions. One thing I'll add is I think Norway has done some experimentation with in situ burning to basically burn it off. The U.S. to date has not allowed that to even be tested. So the one thing that might actually work as a last ditch effort to get some of the oil off the water, we haven't even tested for yet extensively. So it's kind of it's a situation that just is mind-boggling if a large oil spill were to happen.
Hi, my question's about, it seems like commerce is getting fairly far ahead of our ability to respond to catastrophe. The question was great for the technology to clean it up. Can you tell us where the nearest containment equipment is for an oil spill in Canada or the US? And my second question on that would be, there's cruises to the Arctic from Nunavut. You can cruise like a cruise ship. where's the nearest Coast Guard response from either country if there were a catastrophe on a cruise ship?
Well, I won't speak to the U.S. State of preparedness, although I can say it's better than the situation in Canada. There are a handful of small shipping containers, the real small ones, and only a handful positioned across the Canadian Arctic with booms in them to deal with an oil spill, which would essentially be for a small leak from the engine room of a ship. Not even from the fuel tanks, because the booms wouldn't be large enough. The entire population of Nunavut, the territory of Nunavut, is 30,000 people, and that's 1/5 of Canada's geography, right? So that there are no people, there are no ports, and Canada is only just waking up to the challenges of all this increased activity. And yes, you're right about the cruise ships. We've been really lucky so far. If the Clipper Adventurer, which went aground on a rock a few years ago, had done so during an Arctic storm, it would have been torn apart and 150 people would have died. No question. And I'll just raise one more thing. On any given day, more people fly over the Canadian Arctic than live on the ground. So if you're flying to Europe from Seattle, you're flying over the Canadian Arctic, and if you have to crash land in winter, just pray it's a really bad crash.
Yeah.
Because we will not get to you, and you will freeze. I'm sorry to be so harsh, but this is the reality that we deal with. The Arctic is a large, remote, dangerous place, and yet there are all kinds of things that are pulling human activity north, and governments have to step up and take on some responsibility.
Just from the Alaska perspective, the largest Coast Guard base in the country is in Kodiak on the southern coast of Alaska, which sounds okay, so that's pretty good, right? But that's 850 nautical miles from Point Barrow. And so even though there are fixed-wing C-130 aircraft, long-range helicopters, and a number of cutters based in Kodiak, the ability to get them up to the Arctic would take quite a while. However, for the last 5 summers, the U.S. Coast Guard has deployed a couple of helicopters and some people up to the North Slope, both to provide some kind of marginal response capability, but also to test out gear, operational procedures, and that sort of thing in the Arctic. So we're slowly gaining. For many years, we never went up there other than an occasional icebreaker cruise, mainly focused on science. But now I think we're gaining, the service is gaining some operational experience in the Arctic, and certainly, if nothing else, becoming aware of what the problems are. But the same thing with oil spill response equipment. Most of it is probably in Prince William Sound in Valdez and down in Anchorage on Cook Inlet. There is some in Prudhoe Bay, but it would be, but for a very large spill, it would be a massive undertaking. We would have to pull equipment from nationwide, as we did in the Gulf of Mexico several years ago.
Chuck, yes.
What do you know about the oil recovery barge that's sitting, Shell's oil recovery barge that's sitting down at the dock?
Only that this Arctic containment system, of which the barge is part of it, is, I believe, still figures in their plans for if and when they go back to the Arctic to try to complete one of those exploratory wells. Well, it had some problems, yeah. You're right.
If I could just mention here, one of the things that we need to make absolutely certain happens in Arctic offshore drilling into the future in all Arctic countries is a requirement for same-season relief well capability. And because the Arctic season is very short, that capability has to be right there on standby, ready to go. Otherwise, that oil is going to be spilling into the ocean from a blown-out well for at least another 10 months before the ice clears and equipment can get back. So in various countries, including Canada, there's been an effort to reduce that requirement of same-season relief well capability, and the general public in both countries must stand firm on this.
Agreed, yeah.
Yes.
What do you know about the Canadian efforts on that pipeline that's coming out and their work with the native peoples there?
Well, there are two pipelines proposed for the west coast of British Columbia. The first is a new pipeline that would go from Alberta to Kitimat on the north coast of British Columbia, just south of the Alaska Panhandle. And regulatory approval has been granted, except for the last stage, which is the Prime Minister deciding probably in the next month whether to green light it. The good news there is that the coastal First Nations, the Canadian Indian tribes along the coast, are adamantly opposed and are going to tie that project up in the courts for at least a decade. If you want to make an investment in stopping oil tanker traffic on the West Coast, give some money to a First Nations legal defense fund. The second pipeline is actually a pipeline expansion proposal, and that's for the Kinder Morgan Trans Mountain Pipeline that comes to Burnaby, which is alongside Vancouver Harbor, and then out down Georgia Strait and out through Juan de Fuca Strait. Proposal is to essentially increase the capacity of that pipeline 4- or 5-fold and start using tankers to ship diluted bitumen to Asia. I'm actually an intervener in the regulatory process, so I'm not exactly objective on this. But I can tell you that most people in British Columbia see absolutely no gain for British Columbia and a whole lot of risk being imposed upon us. And the strongest opponents of this pipeline are the city councils of Vancouver, Burnaby, and Victoria. And I'm actually confident that with your help, the help of Washington State, perhaps some of your federal politicians, that we could stop the second project also.
Okay, thank you. That's all the time we have for questions from both panelists. Dr. Byers does have to leave to catch a ferry. He's hoping to. I was going to give them each an extra minute or two, but if he doesn't need that, I'm going to present you, both of you, with a gift we always give to our speakers. It's Watkin Places 2, and we hope you both will come back and enjoy what we have here.
Thank you very much.